Ormiston Genealogy Part 4.
1567, Mary's visits to Stirling were chiefly to see her son, whom she had sent to be under the care of Huntly and Argyll. About 1567, James Ormiston married a second wife, Margaret, widow of John Sinclair of Herdmeston. By his first wife he had a son, Walter. February 1567, Maitland must surely have known of the plan. Paris, in his deposition, said Bothwell's man Black Ormiston came to Linlithgow Palace secretly the night before the abduction and had a long earnest conversation. It seems inconceivable that the scheme should not have been outlined also to the Queen, if only to secure her cooperation. Mary, still envisaging Bothwell as her help and support among the nobles, and not as the reprobate adventurer whom his enemies later built up in their writings, felt in no position to withstand this latest. July 4, 2013-82. Proposition. It was presented to her by Bothwell, using the same arguments which he had used to himself, as a convenient solution to her difficulties. Once within the castle of Dunbar, Bothwell made his second planned move, an equally characteristic one, although in this case the Queen was not consulted beforehand. He decided to complete his formal abduction of her person by the physical possession of her body. His intentions in this aggressive act were as before perfectly straightforward. He intended to place the Queen in a situation from which she could not possibly escape marrying him. Bothwell was certainly not in love with Mary, although he may have accompanied his actions with some sort of protestations, such as he thought suitable to the occasion. But in the course of the gratification of his ambitions, rape was not the sort of duty from which Bothwell was likely to shrink. Melville, who was present in the castle at the time, and only allowed to go free the next morning, was quite certain that the ravishment had taken place. The Queen could not but marry him, seeing he had ravished her and lain with her against her will. It was Melville who tells us that Bothwell had already boasted that he would marry the Queen, who would or would not, yea, whether she would herself or not. A fortnight later Mary gave a very vivid description of her experiences to the Bishop of Dunblane, who was instructed to explain her hasty marriage to Bothwell to the French court. First of all, Bothwell awaited us, by the way, accompanied with a great force, and led us with all diligence to Dunbar, and there, in words which seem positively touching. Albeit we found his doings rude, yet were his words and answers gentle. Now Bothwell, not accepting her promise to marry him, refused to have the consummation of the marriage delayed, but kept up a continuous barrage of importunity, accompanied none the less by force until he has finally driven us to end the work begun at such time and such form as he thought might best serve his turn. Geo noted. Staged. Ref. The Personal Rule. 9 February 1567. The plot to remove Henry Stuart, Earl of Darnley, Queen Mary's second husband who was crowned as King Henry, was planned for this night. The Queen spent part of the evening with Darnley, but left him betimes for Holyrood to be present at a masque in honour of the marriage of two of her servants. On this night of September 7, 2013-83, February 1567, the Provost House was blown up and the King killed. Bothwell, aided by Archibald Douglas and 2 or 3 inferior agents in the plot, had meantime concealed gunpowder in the room below Darnley's. This was fired a few hours after the Queen's departure, and the house blown up with everyone in it. The bodies of Darnley and his servant were found the next morning in an orchard some 80 yards from the house, where it was at first supposed they had been carried by the force of the explosion. Neither, however, bore any marks of violence or traces of burning, and a letter from Father Edmunds, a Jesuit envoy at that time in Edinburgh, tells a tale which has now won pretty general credence, that this poor prince, hearing the noise of people round the house trying false keys to open the outlets, rushed forth himself, by a door that opened into the garden, in his shirt, with a pelisse, to fly from the peril. And there was strangled and brought out of the garden into a little orchard beyond the wall of the grounds. Suspicion falls on Mary, but it was said that the prime movers in the murder were James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, and the Black Laird, from his own confession, was privy to it and an accessory before the fact. 169. James Ormiston of that ilk, the Black Laird, say scene 1550, was concerned in the assassination of King Henry Darnley, see Teviotdale Book. 15 February 1567, Darnley's body was embalmed by the Queen's orders and buried in Holyrood Chapel by the side of James v. 1567. Bothwell was in the flower of his age, about 30, when Darnley perished. He was certainly not old enough to have been Mary's father, for he was not 6 years her senior. His father died in 1556, and Bothwell came young into the Hepburn inheritance of impoverished estates, high offices, and wild, reckless blood. According to Buchanan, Bothwell, in early youth, was brought up at the house of his great-uncle, Patrick Hepburn, Bishop of Moray, who certainly was a man of profligate life. It is highly probably that Bothwell was educated in France. Ref. The Mystery of Mary Stuart by Andrew Lang. Spring 1567, Mary Stuart was broken in health, distraught, nervously concerned about the future of her government in Scotland. Quite apart from the evidence of events, it seems extremely doubtful whether they were the sort of couple, Mary and Bothwell, who would have been drawn to each other if political considerations had not been involved. Practical ambition had driven Bothwell to woo the Queen, this elegant, coquettish, literary-minded, slightly cold woman, with her graceful, leaning figure, her red gold hair, her laughing, flirtatious ways. Her demand for obeisance, to which she had been accustomed from her earliest years, was not the type to appeal to Bothwell, the lover of the lusty Bessie Crawford, the dominating courtesan Janet Beaton, or the plaintive submissive Anna Thronson. Of all Mary Stuart's qualities, her courage and gaiety, her ability to make quick decisions and pull herself rapidly out of an untenable situation were those most likely to appeal to Bothwell. But these had been strangely in abeyance since her virtual nervous breakdown at Jedburgh. The important fact about Mary Stuart in Bothwell's eyes was that she was Queen Regnant of Scotland, with the power to make her husband king consort and effective ruler of the country. Ref. The Personal Rule. March 1567. An incident occurred described by Robert Gore Brown in his 170, Lord Bothwell. Queen Mary had ordered Queen Elizabeth's agent Randolph to leave the country. He lingered and repeated messages failed to dislodge him. March 1567. About 10 in the morning, Ormiston called and remarked that he was ready. The Black Laird had a compelling manner, and within an hour a little party of half a dozen was on its way. A quarter of a mile out of Edinburgh, Ormiston broke the silence. His patron, Lord Bothwell, wanted to know why the Queen of England objected to him as a member of the Peace Commission. "I have no will to speak," was Randolph's circumspect reply. "Things are verified by the Earl's own countrymen. If true, they are unhonourable. If false, he may revenge it on the speakers." Ormiston asked if Randolph would care to hear Bothwell's own version. "I will speak with any that speak with me," came the lofty reply. Ormiston gave a sign, and a gentleman spurred his horse to a trot. Bothwell received the message at Seaton and caught up the party a little way beyond the July 4, 2013-85. Castle. A chilly greeting, and the Earl took God to witness as a gentleman born of a noble house that he had never spoken but honourably of the Queen of England. He would oppose his body to any man who spoke the contrary, desiring Her Majesty to be satisfied with his purgation. "I will report your speech," was Randolph's stiff reply. "But the sooner your lordship justifies himself and has the matter tried, the more it will be to his honour, and change the subject to his expulsion." Randolph's allusion was to scandal spread by one Dandy Pringle that he had heard Bothwell say, 171, that the Queens of England and Scotland taken together could not make one honest woman. This was probably a garbled misrendering of a remark about an old scandal about Queen Mary's mother, Mary of Lorraine, and Cardinal Beton. Geo noted, Mary had to speak directly to Ormiston for the sake of Bothwell, as well as forcing the English ambassador out of Scotland. Mary trembles for the safety of her child. Bothwell, that despotic man, ruled thee with shameful, overbearing will, and with his philters and his hellish arts. No! No! All the arts he used were man's superior strength. Schiller. Ref. Mary Queen of Scots, A Narrative and Defence by Reverend Alexander Walker. 12 of April 1567. Darnley's murder was not allowed to drop, and the Earl of Bothwell was brought to trial. He was then too powerful for the prosecution to succeed, and was acquitted. 19 April 1567. Bothwell obtained 172. Ratification of all his possessions and honours. 1567. Robert Ormiston was accused with his nephew James Ormiston in the assassination of King Henry. Darnley was tried with him and attainted, having previously reserved the Melrose estate to his son. July 4, 2013-86. 23 April 1567. On this Tuesday, Mary started back to Edinburgh from a visit in Stirling with her baby, James, who was now 10 months old. Mary played with him in peace, happily unaware that this was the last meeting she was ever to have with her son. She had with her Maitland, Huntley, James Melville, and about 30 horsemen. Mary's health was still poor, and while on the road back to Edinburgh, she was seized with a violent pain and had to take rest in a roadside cottage. That night she slept at the Palace of Linlithgow. It is believed several of Mary's nobles knew of her intended kidnapping. Maitland must surely have known of the plan. Paris, in his deposition, said Bothwell's man, Black Ormiston, came to Linlithgow Palace secretly this night before the abduction and had a long earnest conversation. It seems inconceivable that the scheme should not have been outlined also to the Queen, if only to secure her cooperation. 2004 April 1567. Mary and her little troop started back on the road for Edinburgh. But, as they reached the Bridges of Almond, about 6 miles from Edinburgh, Bothwell suddenly appeared with a force of 800 men. Bothwell rode forward, put his hand on the Queen's bridle, and told her that since danger was threatening her in Edinburgh, he proposed to take her to the castle of Dunbar, out of harm's way. It was at this spot within the skirts of Edinburgh that Mary was kidnapped by Bothwell and carried off to Dunbar Castle. Some of Mary's followers reacted disagreeably to the sudden appearance of Bothwell, but the Queen said gently that she would go with the Earl Bothwell rather than be the cause of bloodshed. Queen Mary always asserted that she refused Bothwell's previous proposals of marriage on the grounds that there were too many scandals about her husband's death, despite the fact that Bothwell had been legally acquitted of complicity by Parliament. However, now Mary envisioned Bothwell as her help and support among the nobles, and felt in no position to withstand this latest proposition. Therefore, without more ado, she allowed herself to be conducted about 40 miles across the heart of Scotland, skirting the capital itself. She seemed to accept Bothwell's story so totally that she made no attempt to seek rescue from the country people as she passed. At midnight the Queen was within Dunbar Castle, surrounded by a force of Bothwell's men. The gates of the castle were firmly shut behind her. July 4, 1387. Bothwell confidently believed that an abduction would not only put an end to further consultation and discussion about the marriage, in which his reasoning was perfectly correct, but also distract public attention from his connection with Darnley's death by the very flagrancy of the act. Here, of course, his reasoning was disastrously wrong. The intended abduction was widely known about beforehand among Mary's nobles. Lennox knew about it on the Tuesday, and Kirkcaldy of Grange, Bothwell's bitter enemy, mentioned it on Wednesday, the day it actually happened. Most believe the plan was presented to Mary by Bothwell, using most of the same arguments which he had used for himself, as a convenient solution to her difficulties. The double process of divorce. No one can anticipate how wide may be the discussions opened by this discovery. Burton, Ref. Mary Queen of Scots, A Narrative and Defence by Reverend Alexander Walker. 3 May 1567. Bothwell was divorced from his wife, Lady Jean Gordon, and on the 7th, the marriage was formally annulled. 12 May 1567. Bothwell was created Duke of Orkney, and James Ormiston and 3 other gentlemen were knighted. In December, they, with others, were again tried and attainted, and their estates were forfeited. John Craig in the banns. An odious, a scandalous, and an infamous marriage. Craig, Ref. Mary Queen of Scots, A Narrative and Defence by Reverend Alexander Walker. The Waffle Wedding. Then come at once the lightning and the thunder, and distant echoes tell that all is rent asunder. Old Play, Ref. Mary Queen of Scots, A Narrative and Defence by Reverend Alexander Walker. 13 to 15 May 1567. Mary was married to Bothwell, whom she had created Duke of Orkney at the Great Council Chamber at Holyrood, as the chapel marriage register still shows. The service was performed, not by a priest of her own church, but by the Protestant Bishop of Orkney. Mary and Bothwell are now anxious to secure the person of the infant Prince James, for whose protection, almost as soon as the marriage was celebrated, a considerable body of the nobles had entered into an association at Stirling. 11 June 1567. The Confederate lords marched to Borthwick Castle, where Mary and Bothwell are staying. The lords, in fear Bothwell had fled from Edinburgh, appeared before the castle in the night, with a following of some 1,200 men. The Duke, having been warned of their approach, fled to Dunbar Castle. Bothwell escaped by a postern in the rear, and Mary, dressed in the costume of a page, contrived to follow him some hours later. Whether she escaped with the purpose of rejoining him or not, is one of the disputed points in her life, but, however that may be, she fell in with him and was carried off a second time to Dunbar, riding the whole 20 miles on a man's saddle. This was no sooner known than 174. Their friends came to them in troops, among them was the Laird of Ormiston. The Confederate lords determined to seize the Duke, moved out of Edinburgh and the Queen and the Duke moved to meet them. 15 June 1567, the two forces met at Carberry Hill, on the same ground where the English lay at the Battle of Pinkie. Lecroc, the French ambassador, saw both parties and attempted to bring them to an agreement, but each was obdurate, the lords insisting that the Duke should be handed over to them, which the Queen refused to do. The Queen sent 175 Ormiston to ask her Caldey of Grange to speak to her. He came and eventually she went to the Lords while Bothwell the Duke of Orkney fled. The two never met again. 15 June 1567. Mary Seton, one of the four Marys, is with Queen Mary throughout the humiliating scenes of the encounter and surrender to the associate lords at Carberry Hill. Among the four famous Marys, Seton's figure is preeminently familiar and attractive, the Queen's favourite maid of honour. She repaid the affection bestowed on her by a faithful devotion that stood the test alike of court splendour and intrigue, and of 16 years of dreary confinement in English prisons. She alone of the quartet preferred the service of her unhappy mistress to any of her numerous suitors, and died unmarried. After the marriage of Mary Livingston, and the discovery of the breaches of faith of which both Mary Bayton and Mary Fleming had been guilty, the Queen seems to have specially relied upon Mary Seton as her confidential companion. Not Holyrood but Loch Leven. 'Tis a weary life this, vaults overhead, and grates and bars around. The Woodsman, Ref. Mary Queen of Scots, a narrative and defence by Rev. Alexander Walker. 16th June 1567. During the night, Lindsay and Ruthven, two of the harshest among Mary's opponents, conveyed her from Edinburgh to Loch Leven with the utmost haste and secrecy. Loch Leven, the scene of Mary's imprisonment after Carberry Hill and the flight of Bothwell, is a lake about 12 miles round. It is dotted with islands, that on which the castle stands being some half-mile from the land. The captivity at Loch Leven lasted 10 months and a half, and is made important by Mary's enforced signature of the fatal deeds of abdication, 1567. Following Mary's surrender, Bothwell escaped to the continent, but was captured and imprisoned at Dragsholm in Denmark. July 4, 2013-90. The silver casket contained the only proof that Moray, Morton and Lennox did ever pretend to have against the Queen. Goodall, Ref. Mary Queen of Scots, a narrative and defence by Rev. Alexander Walker. The next day, 17 June 1567, the Queen was imprisoned at Loch Leven where she agreed to abdicate on behalf of her infant son. While she was on her way there, on this day, Ormiston, with several other nobles, assembled a force, 173, and narrowly failed to rescue her from Ruthven and Lindsay. Loch Leven was bestowed on Douglas, Laird of Loch Leven, by Robert III. Date. His descendant, the Sir Robert Douglas who fell at Pinkie. Date. Married Margaret Erskine, the sister of the Earl of Mar, James VI's favourite mistress, and mother of James Stuart, later Earl of Moray. To her keeping, and that of a later son, Sir William Douglas, Mary was imprisoned. Geo noted, Mary to Ormiston, this surrender was prearranged. Mary needed to go to Loch Leven to complete the remaining 5 months of her pregnancy. July 1567, the Lords of Secret Council prepared 3 instruments, the first, A, setting forth Mary's desire to abdicate in favour of her infant son, the second, B, declaring her brother Moray regent, and the third, C, appointing a provisional council to govern. 17 July 1567. The Earl of Bothwell, James Ormiston, and others were charged for complicity in 177, the murder of Darnley. 24 July 1567. The 3 previously prepared documents for Mary's signature were laid before her, and after some ineffectual cajoling by Sir Robert Melville, Lindesay brutally coerced her into signing, reportedly vowing that if she refused he would sign himself, with her heart's blood, and cast her body into the lake to feed the fishes. This scene is said to have so aroused the pity and indignation of George Douglas, a younger brother of the Castellan, that he forthwith set about contriving her eventual escape. 22 August 1567, invited back to Scotland by his confederates after the Queen's imprisonment at Loch Leven, Moray, James Stuart, was by then appointed Regent of Scotland. 1567, when James Ormiston was outlawed. Later in 1567, an effort was made to appropriate Lady Sinclair's ownership of Herdmanston. Her son William and other Sinclairs eventually blocked and overturned the actions by Regent Moray and his co-conspirators. 27 August 1567, the Privy Council issued orders to James Ormiston of that ilk to vacate the towers and fortalices of Ormiston and Nether, 178, Ancrum, 7 September 1567. A similar order was passed to him and his wife, Margaret 179 Sinclair, widow of John Sinclair of Herdmanston, to vacate Herdmanston. October-November 1567. Geo noted, twins born to Mary, probably sent to France about April 1568. Probably born about a month premature. Contrary to some reports, Geo believed they survived. 3 November 1567. Mr. Afterwards Sir William Drury, Marshal and Deputy Governor of Berwick, wrote to Sir Nicholas Throckmorton that the Regent made a sudden raid at Alnwick on the previous market day against the outlaws of Liddesdale and captured 36 of them, but the Laird of Ormiston escaped. 20 December 1567. Parliament designated the Earl of Bothwell and James Ormiston of that ilk, 181, and others as guilty, and their estates were legally forfeited. May 1568. The young man known as Little Douglases stole the keys from Sir William Douglas and released the Queen from Lochleven. He led her to a small boat he had in readiness and rowed her to the Kinross shore. He guarded against instant pursuit by locking the gates behind him and throwing the keys into the lake. A party of Mary's adherents, headed by Lord Seaton, George Douglas and Hamilton of Orbiston, were in waiting with horses, and the whole party fled for their lives to Niddry Castle, and thence to Hamilton. Queen once more. No chieftain there rode half so free, or half so light and gracefully. 'Twas sweet to see her ringlets pale wide waving in the Southland gale. Hogg, Ref. Mary Queen of Scots, a narrative and defence by Reverend Alexander Walker. The spot where Mary landed still bears the name of the Queen's No. The Hamiltons and others raise an army for her, and in a few days Mary was at the head of 6,000 men. George Douglas was the prime mover in the schemes to which Mary ultimately owed her escape from prison, his chivalrous sympathy with her having, it is said, been first awakened by Lindsay's brutal conduct at the signing of the deeds of abdication. Suspicion falling on him, after an abortive attempt to smuggle Mary across the lake, disguised as the laundress, he was expelled from the fortress. However, he continued to lurk in the neighbourhood, and in secret communication with the Queen and her ladies, and with a young page and kinsman of his house, a youth of 16. Known as the Little Douglases, Willie Douglas, to whom Mary finally owed her successful escape. George Douglas accompanied the Queen to Hamilton and Langside, but was not killed in the battle, as represented by Walter Scott in The Abbot. He was one of the 16 persons who crossed the Solway with her on her flight into England, and during her 18 years of captivity, proved himself one of her most faithful friends. July 4, 2013 93. Into England Scotland's Saifuo treachery fay highest estate to lowest degree, that niver a man door lift a hand for his Queen and country. Old Ballad, Ref. Mary Queen of Scots, a narrative and defence by Reverend Alexander Walker. 13th May 1568. The Scottish Queen's forces were defeated by Regent Moray at Langside. James Ormiston was present at the Battle of Langside, wrote Douglas of Bonjedward to Mo of that ilk. But some say they would not suffer, 182, him to be in the Queen's company. But in a statement drawn up by Lennox about 4th October, he says that after the battle, 183, Queen Mary spoke to Ormiston. Geo noted, important, 13 May 1568. Among the numerous members of the great House of Hamilton who had distinguished themselves fighting for the Queen at Langside, was John Hamilton of Bothwell. He, with 6 others of the name, were sentenced to death after the battle, as traitors to their infant king, James VI. By the intercession of Knox with the Regent, their lives were spared, and they were set at liberty, their punishment being mitigated to forfeiture of their estates. 1568. Moray's prompt action and excellent generalship when the news reached him of the Queen's escape from Lochleven, and her intended progress to Dumbarton from Hamilton, secured the triumph of his cause. Taking up his position at Glasgow, he intercepted the march of the royal troops, seized the most advantageous point on the hill of Langside, and won the victory that decided his sister's fate and the destinies of Scotland. His power being now completely established, Moray governed for some years with judgment and vigour. His partisans surnamed him the Good Regent, and the severities he practised towards his defeated foes have perhaps been too much insisted on by his enemies, taking into consideration the turbulent times in which he lived, but nothing can excuse the ungenerous rancour with which he pursued the unhappy Mary after her fall. He appeared in England at the Commission of Inquiry into her conduct in the odious character of her accuser and vilifier, and was the chief promoter of the slander against her personal character promulgated by the pen of George Buchanan. 16 May 1568. The Queen fled Langside, landing at Workington in Cumberland. She claimed the protection of Queen Elizabeth of England, by whose orders she was conducted to Carlisle. While Queen Mary was at Carlisle, Alexander Pringle, an enemy, wrote to the Countess of Lennox, Darnley's mother, asking the Countess to get a letter to Lord Scrope, Henry le Scrope, 9th Baron Scrope of Bolton, to capture the Laird of Ormiston and Robin his brother, who daily repaired to the Queen at Carlisle in secret, or Queen Elizabeth's letter to 184, Fergus the Graham and Riche the Graham, who are daily in Ormiston's company, and that the warden may compass Ormiston and Robin. By Robin was meant Robert Ormiston, James's uncle. In the statement of Lennox mentioned above, Eliot of Withor in Liddesdale was said to be keeping the two Ormistons. In a 185 note about border offenders, written in April 1569, mention is made of a horse, 186, sold into Scotland, and now lies in the custody of the Laird of Ormiston. Geo noted, Grahams were Lennox spies. 16th June 1568. The Queen was transferred to Bolton Castle, and in the beginning of 1569 to Tutbury in Staffordshire, where she remained for 15 years. She was then taken from castle to castle, and finally, to Fotheringhay in Northamptonshire, where she was arraigned for complicity with the conspiracy of Anthony Babington and executed on 8 February 1587, Scottish Nations. Article Mary Queen of Scots. At Bolton, Mary attempted to repeat the successful evasion she had made from Borthwick the year before. She had herself let down from a window and made off through a path still pointed out along the rocky terrace in the neighbourhood. At Leybourne Shore, about 2 miles from the castle, Lord Scrope and his people overtook and brought her back. Mary's escape from Loch Leven Castle, and the 16 days which intervened between then and her crossing the drawbridge of Carlisle Castle, were her last of liberty. The series of her prisons, from her landing in England to her murder at Fotheringhay 19 years later, was as follows: Lowther Castle, Wharton Hall, Bolton Castle, Tutbury Castle, Wingfield Manor, Tutbury, 2. Coventry, Tutbury, 3. Chatsworth, Sheffield Castle, Chatsworth, 2. Baxton, Sheffield, 2. Worksop Manor, Sheffield, 3. Wingfield Manor, 2. Chartley Castle, Tixall, Chartley, 2. Fotheringhay Castle. 1568, George Douglas travelled to France, and Queen Mary Stuart wrote to Queen Elizabeth, commending him to her favour as follows: I beg you to grant your passport to the gentleman who is the bearer of this, and that you will vouchsafe him so honourable a reception as may show that the service he performed in delivering me was agreeable to you. He goes to pass some time in France to learn the language, and to be rewarded in some measure by the king, my good brother, and my uncle, by their desire. From the wish they have to know him who has achieved a deed that was so acceptable to them, and I have willingly given him leave, seeing that I do not require so many of my good servants here. She also wrote letters to Catherine de Medicis and the French king, begging them to befriend him, on the grounds that he had delivered her from the hands of her mortal foes at the peril of his life, and the sacrifice of his nearest ties of kindred. She adds that he requires now to seek his living in France, for he must lose all he had in Scotland, unless I am shortly mistress there again. 1568. John, 6th Lord Lindesay of the Byres, was the son of that Lord Lindesay who had distinguished himself as the most faithful and vigilant of Mary's guardians, or Lord's keepers, during her babyhood. The son, however, showed himself very differently disposed towards his queen. He was one of the sternest and most uncompromising of her opponents, a zealous Protestant, and firm adherent of Knox. It was avowedly because of his fierce and resolute character that he was dispatched by the associate lords to wring from Mary her assent to the deeds of abdication. He married one of the famous 7 fair porches of Loch Leven, the beautiful daughters of Sir Robert Douglas and James versus Quondam Mistress, and was thus the brother-in-law of Moray. He was one of the July 4, 2013 96, commissioners appointed by Moray to appear against Mary at the Conference of York in 1568, and took an active part in the outrage upon her son James VI, known as the Raid of Ruthin, 4 October 1568. Next comes from Lennox, Darnley's father, attempts at producing a discourse. This can be dated. It ends with the remark that, after Langside fight, Mary spoke with Ormiston and Hob Ormiston, who were of the chiefest murderers of the king, her husband. Not true. Of course. These men now live with the Laird of Withor, in Liddesdale, who keepeth in his house a prisoner, one Andrew Carey, of Fordenside, by her commandment. This was Andrew Kerr of Fordenside, the most brutal of the murderers of Riccio. In a list of offences committed by the Queen's party, a list perhaps in John Wood's hand, we read that Withal, and other Elliots, took ane honest and true gentleman, Kerr of Foldenside, and keep him prisoner by Mary's command, while Withal cherishes the two Ormistons. This discourse of Lennox was prepared for the York Conference to inquire into Mary's case, where it was not delivered. Ref. The Mystery of Mary Stuart by Andrew Lang. 26 January 1569, 3 February 1569. The Queen was carried to Tutbury after a stay at Bolton of rather more than 6 months. Here she was put into the charge of the Earl of Shrewsbury and his notorious wife, the hard-headed Bess of Hardwicke. Tutbury was cold, damp and unfurnished on Mary's arrival, and plenishings were sent for her use from the royal stores in the Tower of London. 7 February 1569. Mary's commissioners to Elizabeth arrived at Tutbury, where they had interviews with their mistress although she was in bed and suffering from illness brought on by the inhospitalities of the naked castle. At Tutbury, the manuscript of A Defence of Queen Mary's Honour was submitted to the Queen and modified by her, to be printed in the spring of 1570. This first stay came to an end with her removal later in the year to Wingfield Manor House, 13 May 1569, among the numerous members of the great House of Hamilton who had distinguished themselves fighting for the Queen at Langside was John Hamilton of Bothwell. He, with 6 others of the name, were sentenced to death after the battle, as traitors to their infant king, James VI. By the intercession of Knox with the Regent, their lives were spared, and they were set at liberty, their punishment being mitigated to forfeiture of their estates. 15 November 1569. The house and lands of Woodhouse-Lee, near Roslin, had been the marriage portion of John Hamilton's wife, a daughter of James I's favourite, Oliver Sinclair. She retained possession of her inheritance after sentence had been passed against her husband at the Battle of Langside, not supposing the regent's decree to include her own personal property. Moray, however, had apportioned this share of the spoil to Sir James Bellenden, the justice clerk, who promptly claimed possession and brutally took it. Hamilton's wife had only the day before given birth to a child, but she was dragged from her bed and thrust out of her house into the snow. She was found the next morning wandering in the woods delirious, and died shortly after. Her husband's grief and fury were great, and he vowed vengeance, not on the actual perpetrator, but on the prime mover of the outrage, on Moray himself. Hamilton was encouraged, it is said, by several of his kinsmen, among others the Archbishop of St. Andrews. 20 December 1569. There was a rebellion in the north of England headed by Thos. Percy, 7th Earl of Northumberland, and Charles Neville, 1st Earl of Westmoreland. The rising was unsuccessful, and on this night, the 2 earls fled from Naworth to Liddesdale, where they took refuge with Black Ormiston. 187. John Armstrong of the Side, the Laird's Jock, and other outlaws, as reported by Thomas Radcliffe, the 3rd Earl of Sussex, Lord President of the North, to James Stuart, the Earl of Moray, Regent of Scotland. When Martin Elliot of Braidley, who was loyal to the Regent, met them with his following, before the parties began, 188, to fight, Elliot said to Ormiston that he would be sorry to enter into deadly feud with him by bloodshed, but he would charge him and the rest before the Regent for keeping the rebels, and if he did not put them off the country the next day, he would do his worst against them, and so they parted on a sort of composition. The earls then went on to Hector Armstrong of Harelaw. 22 December 1569. The Regent wrote to Sussex that he had heard of this move, 189. The same day George Carey, English envoy to Scotland, was instructed to report to the Regent the presence of the earls in Liddesdale, and to press him to obtain their capture by offering a pardon to Ormiston for the murder of Darnley, or by offer of 190 rewards to his associates. Also, on the same day the Regent wrote to William Cecil, afterwards Lord Burleigh, Secretary of 191, State of England, that the rebel earls had gone to Harelaw Woods under the protection of the Laird of Ormiston and other outlaws. 24 December 1569. It was reported to Lord Hunsdon and Sir Ralph Sadleir, both active in repressing the Northern Rebellion. 192. That the Regent had been actively trying to arrest the earls and had issued an offer of pardon to Ormiston, but it had been found that Ormiston and the outlaws had left Harelaw Woods, and the earls also. 25 December 1569. The Regent arranged with Martin Elliot that the latter should cause Hector Armstrong to entice the Earl of 193, Northumberland, to a parley, and the Earl was thus captured. Northumberland's followers pursued the Elliot captors, but the latter got clear to Jedburgh and reached the Regent in Edinburgh on the 27th. Meanwhile, it was reported that Ormiston and his party spoiled the Earl's house and took his wife's jewels, 30 score Portugal ducats and all their 194 clothing. Northumberland and Westmoreland were both attainted. The former was handed over to the English and beheaded 1572. The latter escaped to the continent and died at Newport some 10 years later. See para 717. Geo noted, "Not true that Ormiston broke into the Earl's house and took jewels. This is false." 1569. Regent Moray was engaged in negotiations with the English court for obtaining possession of the captive queen in exchange for the Earl of Northumberland, who had fled into Scotland after the Northern Rebellion. And it seems evident that he meditated the death of his sister had the bargain been concluded. July 4, 2013-99. 1569 to 1570, Northern Rebellions, 22 or 24 January 1570. Regent Moray murdered at Linlithgow by Hamilton of Bothwell, in revenge for a private wrong. Having learnt that the regent was to pass through Linlithgow on his way from Stirling to Edinburgh, Bothwell made preparations for taking his life. Concealing himself in an empty house belonging to the archbishop, in the main street of Linlithgow, he took his stand in a wooden gallery, which had a window towards the street. Spread a feather bed on the floor, to hinder the noise of his feet from being heard. Hung up a black cloth behind him, that his shadow might not be observed from without. And after all this preparation calmly expected the regent's approach, who had lodged, during the night, in a house not far off. Some indistinct information of the danger which threatened him had been conveyed to the regent, and he paid so much regard to it, that he resolved to return by the same gate through which he had entered, and to fetch a compass round the town. But as the crowd about the gate was great, and he himself unacquainted with fear, he turned and went straight through the town. The throng of people obliging him to move very slowly, gave the assassin time to take so true an aim, that he shot him, with a single bullet, through the lower part of his belly, and killed the horse of a gentleman who rode on the other side. His followers instantly endeavoured to break into the house whence the blow had come, but they found the door strongly barricaded, and before it could be forced open, Hamilton had mounted a fleet horse, which stood ready for him at a back passage, and was got far beyond their reach. The regent died the same night of his wound. Robertson, History of Scotland, Book V. Bothwell fled to Hamilton, and thence to France, where he entered the service of the Guises. Thou records that a large bribe was offered him to induce him to undertake the assassination of Coligny, but he indignantly refused, saying that he had but avenged a righteous cause in slaying the regent, and that he would take no man's life for hire. On the downfall of the Regent Morton, he ventured back to Scotland, and was graciously received by James VI, who, on his asking pardon for his offence, exclaimed, "God's blessing on him whose son ye be, for had ye not taken the life of yon traitor, I had never lived to wear my own crown." Moray's character and policy have been sketched as follows by his contemporary, Lord Herries, Walter Ointine, Walter Armstrong Book, Catalogue of Drawings. Moray did not only foment all these by past distractions, but made himself head of the faction, and when the alteration of religion offered, he presently embraced it, by which means he had all the people of the reformed religion to stick by him like burrs. And now he has fortified himself with Queen Elizabeth's assistance. After this you shall see him cross the Queen, Mary, in all her designs. You shall see a way laid to intercept her person, but it failed. You shall see him afterwards cross her in her marriage. Then he shall be the cause of division betwixt her, Mary, and her husband, to evite succession. You shall see him have a hand in David Rizzio's slaughter, in the Queen's chamber, when she was great with child, in hope of abortion. You shall see him have a hand in the murder of her husband the king, in her marriage with Bothwell, and all that followed till she was banished the kingdom. And what would have become of her son King James, if he had lived himself, many were doubtful. 1571. George Douglas returned to the Queen Mary in her imprisonment, probably to assist in the projected escape from Sheffield, and, on the failure of the scheme, was sent on a mission to Scotland. The Queen again writing to Elizabeth to beg safe conduct for him. She also wrote the same day to the Archbishop of Glasgow, who administered the funds of her French property, bidding him offer to settle 25,000 francs on a young French lady, Mademoiselle La Verrière, to whom he had betrothed himself, but whose mother objected to the marriage on the score of his poverty. The arrangements were never concluded, and 4 years later George Douglas returned to Scotland, married Lady Berry, the rich widow of one of his former Fisher friends. He exerted himself several times on the Queen's behalf, with her son, James VI, and vainly urged him to send an army into England when her proposed execution was first announced. 1571. The Earl of Lennox, Mary's father-in-law, shot and killed at Stirling in the raid of 1571. Ridolfi plot. Mary plots against Elizabeth with Duke of Norfolk, who is executed. 1572. Regent Mar dies. 30 July 1572. A general amnesty was proclaimed from the operation of which James Ormiston was specifically exempted. 196. 1571. 1573. Nothing is known of Ormiston's doings in the next 2 years, and the only mention of him is on 26 December 1571, 195, 22 February 1572, and 28 January 1573, when various persons gave security not to have intercourse with him and other declared traitors. 1573. End of civil war in Scotland. Mary's party crushed. 1573. There is a crowd of squires, loyal, gallant Arthur Erskine, Willie Douglas, who drew Mary forth of prison, the two Standons, English equerries of Darnley, whose lives are unwritten romances, Lennox lairds, busy Minto, Provost of Glasgow and Hewstone, and valiant dubious Thomas Crawford, called Gauntlets, and shifty Drumcastle. Spies like Rokeby, assassins if need or opportunity arise, copper captains like Captain Cullen, and most truculent of all, Bothwell's lambs, young Tala and the Black Laird of Ormiston, he who, on the day of his hanging, said, "With God I hope this night to sup." Said he, "Of all men on the earth I have been one of the proudest and sick, high-minded, and most filthy of my body. Within these 7 years I never saw 2 good men, nor 1 good deed, but all kind of wickedness. And yet my God would not suffer me to be lost, and has drawn me from them as out of hell. For the which I thank him, and I am assured that I am one of his elect." This devotee used to hang about Mary in Carlisle, when she had fled into England. Not 2 good men, nor 1 good deed, saw Ormiston, in 7 long years of riding the border, and following Bothwell to court, or Warden's raid. Few are the good men, rare are the good deeds, that meet us in this tragic history. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Ref. The Mystery of Mary Stuart by Andrew Lang. 10 November 1573. The Earl of 197 Morton, the Regent, was at Jedburgh holding a justice court, in pursuit of a project for improving his finances, by which he held such courts at the principal towns. At Jedburgh, he received information that James Ormiston was in Hulkwood nearby, and directed Sir John Carmichael to seize him. When they met and grappled, Ormiston threw Carmichael down and would have slain him if his men had not come to his help. Ormiston was taken before the Regent, and on the 24th was sent to Edinburgh, where he was examined on the 11th, 12th and 13th of December, touching the murder of Darnley. On the last day he was visited by Mr. John Brand, minister at Holyrood House, to whom he made a confession, recorded in Pitcairn's Criminal Trials. 13 December 1573. This Englished and modernised confession runs 198, as follows. The Castle of Edinburgh, the which day John Brand, minister at Holyrood House, being sent to the Laird of Black Ormiston to give him comfort by the promise of God's word offered to sinners, and also to require the said Laird to glorify God in showing of the truth. After long conference and prayers made, above the space of an hour, or thereby the said John Brand, minister, said unto him, Sir, although I am truly persuaded that the whole truth ye have showed me of this matter, yet because divers and greater doubts are past of you, and also the memory of men are but weak, therefore if ye thought good, I would write certain of those things briefly that you have spoken. Who answered meekly, for God's sake do the same, write even as I shall speak. As I shall answer unto God with whom I hope this night to sup, I shall declare unto you the whole, from the beginning unto the end of my part. First I confess that the Earl Bothwell showed that same wicked deed unto me in his own chamber in the Abbey on Friday, before the deed was done, and required me to take part with him therein because as he alleged I was a man of activeness. Alas therefore, where I utterly refused and said, God forbid, but if it were upon the field to fight with your lordship unto the death I should not fear my skin cutting. Then the said Earl said, Tush Ormiston, ye need not take fear of this, for the whole lords have concluded the same long since in Craigmillar, all that were there with the Queen, and none dare find fault with it when it shall be done. After which I departed home to Kate's Tams, which was Thomas Henderson's house in Edinburgh, for his mother was called Kate. Being in part sick, I lay down in my bed and lay all Saturday, chiefly for that cause, believing that way to have put off the evil hour. And so I knew no farther of it until Sunday at night, when I being in my chamber in the Blackfriar Wynd, going belted in my gown, John Hepburn and John Hay of Talla came unto me and said, The Queen's grace and lords are passed up to see the King, and my lord is standing at the Black Friar Wind foot and bids you come to him incontinent. Whereupon I laid my gown from me, and took a riding cloak, because I believed all had been well enough now agreed, seeing they had passed up to visit him. And coming, at the first I missed the said earl, for he had come up another close to seek me himself in my own chamber, and there he found my cousin Hob, whom he brought with him, and thereafter met together in the midst of the wind, who took me again, and we all passed up to the friar yard through the slap, i.e., gap in the wall, where Paris and Archie Bethune came and met us, and said all was ready prepared for the setting of the match, and they all inquired how it should be set to. And after divers speakings I said, take a piece of match of 3 or 4 inches long, and kindle the one end of it, and lay to the cold end, and it would burn in time to the train, and so will blow up. After which the Queen passing home, the Earl Bothwell said, speed and close all the doors, for they had 13 false keys of the lodgings made and given, as they said to me, by him that owned the house. After which I departed incontinent and came not nearer, as I shall answer before God, than the door. And as I was coming home, it struck 10 hours, where then I passed to Kate Tam's house to avoid suspicion, that no man should say I was at the deed doing, for I was an hour and more in my bed ere the blast and crack was. Being required by the said minister, if he knew not that the king was otherwise handled by men's hands, for it is commonly spoken that he was brought and worried. Who answered, as I shall answer to my God, I know nothing but he, was blown up, and did inquire the same most diligently of John Hepburn and John Hay, and all that tarried behind me, who swore unto me they never knew no other thing but he was blown up, and so I think it was a work done by God for the punishment of many wicked men, whereof I am one, and a great sinner before God, for the which I ask God mercy. Thirdly, being required, if he knew no further thereafter, answered, at the Easter thereafter, when the bruit began to rise upon all us, and all cried a vengeance upon them that slew the king. It pricked my conscience, and I came unto the Earl Bothwell in his chamber, and said to him, what, the devil is this now, my lord, that everybody suspects you of this deed, and cries a vengeance for the same, and few or no other spoken of but you? Another thing you said to me, who answered, I shall let you see something that I had for MME, who let me see a contract subscribed by 4 or 5 handwritings, which he affirmed to me was the subscription of George Gordon, 5th Earl of Huntly, Archibald Campbell, 5th Earl of Argyll, and the Secretary William Maitland and James Balfour, and alleged that many more Sir promised who would assist him if he were put at, and thereafter read the same contract, which, as I remember, contained these words in effect, that for insomuch as it was thought expedient and most profitable for the Commonwealth, by the whole nobility and lords undersubscribed, that such a young fool and proud tyrant should not reign nor bear rule over them, and that for divers causes therefore, that they all had concluded that he should be put off by one way or another, and whosoever should take the deed in hand or do it, they should defend and fortify it as themselves, for it should be every one of their own reckoned and held done by themselves. Which writing as said Earl showed unto me was devised by Sir James Balfour, subscribed by them all a quarter of a year before the deed was done. After the which I never spoke to the said Earl of it till the day he suffered his assize, where the said Earl standing at the bar, looking down and sad like, I plucked at him and said, Fie, my lord, what the devil is this ye are doing? Your face shows what ye are. Hold up your face for God's sake, and look cheerful. Ye might look so if ye were going to the deed. Alas, and no wortham that ever devised it. I trow it shall make us all mourn. Who answered me, hold your tongue. I would not that it were yet to do. I have a way of escape from it, come as it may, and that you will know betimes. Further, the time when my brother was hurt by the Laird of Cessford, first came word to me that they were slain. And then there came a letter from themselves and said they were only hurt and would not die, but one thing did them more evil than the hurting, viz., that a common brute had risen that I was at the king's slaughter, and therefore desired me to get some good way to purge myself, that it pass no further before ye have done with it. Which letter I took and gave to the Earl Bothwell, who took it and gave it to the Queen. She took it and gave it to the Earl Huntly there present, who read it, and thereafter turned unto me and turned her back and gave a shrug with her shoulder, and passed away and spake nothing to me. Geo noted, very important, Ormiston and Bothwell at the palace. Ormiston was very angry about his brother's Colonel Ormiston letter. Ormiston was also angry about Bothwell involving Ormiston in the plot for no good reason. Bothwell gave the letter to the Queen in Ormiston's presence. This is the whole thing I know, either before or after, as I shall answer to my God with whom I hope to sup. After the which, being inquired if ever the Queen spake with him at any time, or if he knew what was the Queen's mind unto it, answered, as I shall answer to God, she spake never to me nor I to her of it. Nor I knew nothing of her part but as my lord Bothwell shewed me. For I will not speak but the truth for all the gold of the earth, which I desire you, good minister, bear record hereof as ye have written, which I pray you, read over to me. Let me also see it. Which I did before Archibald Douglas, constable of the castle, and George Towers of Bristow and other divers gentlemen and servants being in the chamber. Which being done, he said, for God's sake, sit down and pray for me, for I have been a great sinner otherwise. For the which my God this day is punishing me, for of all men on the earth, I have been one of the proudest and high-minded and most filthy of my body, abusing myself divers ways. But specially I have shed innocent blood of one Michael Hunter with my own hands. Alas therefore, because the said Michael, having me lying upon my back, having a fork in his hand, might have slain me if he pleased, and did it not, which of all things grieves me most in conscience. Also in a rage I hanged a poor man for an horse, with many other wicked deeds, for the which I ask my God mercy. For it's no marvel that I have been wicked for the wicked company that ever I have been in, but specially within these 7 years bypast in, which I never saw 2 good men or 1 good deed, but all kind of wickedness, and yet my God would not suffer me to be lost, and has drawn me from them as out of hell, and has given me leisure and space with good company to repent, for the which I thank him, and is assured that I am one of his elect. These words with many more, crying continually unto his God, even to the very end, crying, My Lord Jesus, sweet Jesus, have mercy upon me, as you have had upon other sinners, in such sort, that he was to the appearance of many one of the most penitent sinners that has been seen this long time, and may be counted an example of God's mercies too. All penitent sinners. Ref. The Ormistons of Teviotdale. 13 December 1573. Moray, who heard Boughton make his deposition, was a partner to fraudulent copies. The portion of the evidence burked by Moray is corroborated, as regards the signatures of the band for Darnley's murder, by Ormiston, in his confession, documented in laying 293. Ormiston, however, probably by an error of memory, says that he saw what Bothwell affirmed to be the signature of Sir James Balfour, in addition to those spoken of by Boughton, namely Argyle, Bothwell, Huntley, and Lethington. But this statement as to Balfour he withdrew in his dying confession as published. Boughton's remark that Lethington's signature came far beneath the rest sounds true. Space would be left above for the signatures of men of higher rank than the secretary. Ref. Mystery of Mary Stuart by Andrew Lang. 14th December 1573. The Laird of Ormiston was drawn on a hurdle from the castle to the place of execution, where, after he had confirmed his confession, asking all people for forgiveness, and forgiving all 100 men, he was hanged and quartered, and his body was burnt. 1573, on his attainder the barony of Ormiston and Gavansland, were conferred, 200, on Captain Anstruther, on whose resignation it was granted to William Kerr of Cessford, warden of the Middle Marches, from whom it passed to his second son Mark, who died without issue in 1603, and the property passed to his elder brother Sir Robert Kerr, created first Earl of Roxburgh. He had no male heir, and was succeeded as second Earl by Sir William Drummond, fourth son of his daughter Jean and John Drummond, Earl of Perth and Melfort. 14th of April 1578, the Duke of Orkney, Bothwell, went to Denmark, where he was imprisoned and died at Dragsham. Scottish Nation, article Bothwell. Ratification of the lands of Ormiston to William Kerr, Laird of Cessford. The King's Majesty, with consent of the 3 estates, convened in Parliament, understanding that there was infeoffment granted of long time past to William Kerr of Cessford, warden of the Middle Marches of this realm, and his heirs heritable of all and whole the lands and barony of Ormiston, with annexes, connexes, parts, pendicles and pertinents, outsets, tenants, tenantries and service of free tenants, together with the tower, fortalice, mains and fishings of the same and all their pertinents, lying within the sheriffdom of Roxburgh, and likewise all and whole the 20 merkland of Maxton, called Gevans lands, lying within the sheriffdom aforesaid, which infeoffment, with all Sassene's rights and other titles made to the said William and his aforesaids, was ratified, approved and confirmed in the Parliament held at Edinburgh on 28 November 1581. Likewise his Majesty's intention and full mind is that the same shall stand in full strength and force in all time hereafter. Albeit lately there was a pretended right and infeoffment made of the said lands to James Ormiston, and his heirs contained therein. Proceeding upon the revocation of the other infeoffment made by us to the said William of before, therefore our said sovereign lord, willing that the said William shall be fully re-established in his right of the said lands in plain Parliament, has revoked and annulled and, by the tenor hereof, revokes, rescinds, abrogates and annuls all and whatsoever infefments, charters, precepts, instruments of say-seen rights, titles and other securities made or granted to the said James, his bairns, posterity or friends in whatsoever manner, or order, or any other persons whatsoever of the said lands, or any part thereof, with all and whatsoever following or proceeding thereupon at any time since the first right thereof acquired by the said William, which was granted to him upon good and weighty considerations, and for the true and thankful service done by the said William to his Majesty at all times and in recompense thereof, and to the effect the said William and his heirs may remain in the full integrity of their right aforesaid, our said Sovereign Lord, with advice of his whole 3 estates in present Parliament, ratifies, approves and confirms all and sundry the infefments, rights, titles and securities made to the said William and his aforesaids of the said lands, with their pertinence, either proceeding upon a resignation of the late Captain Robert Anstruther or otherwise granted in whatsoever manner, or order, decreeing and declaring the same to have full force, strength and effect as is contained therein in all times coming, notwithstanding of any revocation, general or special, made by his grace heretofore, and of the said James Ormiston's infefment proceeding thereupon, granted either to the said James, his bairns, friends, or any other persons, aforesaid, which his Majesty declares shall never effect in time coming, but the said William and his heirs to be in such estate and condition as if the same had never been made, and as the said William's infefment had been made in his Majesty's perfect age, and shall not be subject to any revocation in time coming. 1581. Morton, regent from 1572 to 78 is executed. 1583. James VI took refuge in St Andrews after the raid of Ruthin and its consequences. Mary Steen 84, Mary Seton, with her health giving way under the rigours of the captivity with Queen Mary, retired to France and entered the convent at Rheims, of which the Queen's aunt, Renée of Lorraine, was the head. 1585. James VI begins to assert control of Scotland. The end approaches. Now blooms the lily by the bank, the primrose down the brae, the hawthorn's buddin in the glen. And milk white is the sleigh, the meanest hind in fair Scotland may rove they sweets among, but I, the Queen o' Scotland morn lie imprisoned strong. Burns, Ref. Mary Queen of Scots. A Narrative and Defence by Reverend Alexander Walker. 1586. Babington Plot, to assassinate Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. Those involved in the plot were tried and executed. Mary moved to Fotheringhay Castle to stand trial for her part in the plot and is found guilty. 8 February 1587. Mary Queen of Scots executed. Mary was very much the daughter of her father James V. Like him, she was very royal in her generosity to her poorer subjects and her desire to give them a parental protection. Like him, she was never on easy terms with her nobility. Like him, she was a convinced Catholic, yet by nature, not a persecutor. But Mary was even less fortunate than her father. In her father's reign the Reformation had been a threatening cloud, in hers it was an engulfing storm, and she was no more equipped to come to terms with it than he had been. 2009 July 1587. A designated Act 62 of 1585 declared that any grant of James Ormiston 201 to his children, friends or other persons were of no effect. In the General Amnesty of 29 July 1587, his name was specially exempted. 1 August 1587, by Elizabeth's order, Mary was buried in the cathedral in Peterborough with great pomp. 6 months after her execution, her body having been embalmed and preserved in a leaden coffin at Fotheringhay in the interval. Elizabeth, adhering to her programme of grief and dismay at what she sardonically termed the unhappy accident of the Scottish Queen's execution, sent the Countess of Bedford from London to represent her as chief mourner at the funeral on this day. 1602. After resting in the cathedral for 25 years, Mary's remains were removed to Westminster Abbey to be by her son James VI, and the present monument erected over them in the south aisle of Henry VII's chapel. Note: from The Mystery of Mary Stuart by Andrew Lang. This was written about Mary. There was something divine, Elizabeth said, in the face and manner which won the hearts of her gaolers in Lochleven and in England. Heaven bless that sweet face, cried the people in the streets as the Queen rode by, or swept along with the long train, the targeted tails and stinking pride of women, that Knox denounced. She was gay, as when Randolph met her, in no more state than a burgess wife might use, in the little house of St Andrews, hard by the desecrated cathedral. She could be madly mirthful, dancing, or walking the black midnight streets of Edinburgh, masked, in male apparel, or flitting in homely attire, said her enemies, about the market cross in Stirling. She loved, at sea, to handle the boisterous cables, as Buchanan tells, pursuing her brother Moray on a day of storm, or hard on the doomed Huntley's track among the hills and morasses of the north, or galloping through the red bracken of the October moors, and the hills of the robbers. To heritage, her energy outwore the picked warriors in her company. At other times, in a fascinating languor, she would lie long abed, receiving company in the French fashion, waited on by her Marys, whose four names are four sweet symphonies: Mary Seton and Mary Beaton, Mary Fleming, and Mary Livingstone. To the council board she would bring her woman's work, embroidery of silk and gold. She was fabled to have carried pistols at her saddlebow in war, and she excelled in matches of archery and Pall Mall. Her costumes, when she would be queenly, have left their mark on the memory of men, the ruff from which rose the snowy neck, the brocaded bodice, with puffed and jewelled sleeves and stomacher, the diamonds, gifts of Henri II or of Diane, the rich pearls that became the spoil of Elizabeth, the brooches enamelled with sacred scenes or scenes from fable. Many of her jewels, the ruby tortoise given by Riccio, the enamel of the mouse and the ensnared lioness, passed by Lethington as a token into her dungeon of Loch Leven, the diamonds bequeathed by her to one whom she might not name, the red enamelled wedding ring, the gift of Darnley, the diamond worn in her bosom, the betrothal present of Norfolk, are, to our fancy, like the fabled star ruby of Helen of Troy, that dripped with blood gouts which vanished as they fell. Riccio, Darnley, Lethington, Norfolk, the donors of these jewels, they were all to die for her, as Bothwell too was to perish, the giver of the diamond carried by Paris, the recipient of the black betrothal ring enamelled with bones and tears. Her feet go down to death, her feet that were so light in the dance, her steps take hold on hell, her lips drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil, but her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. The lips that dropped as honeycomb, the laughing mouth, could wildly threaten, and vainly rage or beseech, when she was entrapped at Carberry, or could waken pity in the sternest Puritan when, half-clad, her bosom bare, her loose hair flowing, she wailed from her window to the crowd of hostile Edinburgh. She was of a high impatient spirit. We seem to recognise her in an anecdote told by the Black Laird of Ormiston, in prison before his execution. He had been warned by his brother, in a letter, that he was suspected of the crime, and should get some good way to purge himself. He showed the letter to Bothwell, who read it, and gave it to Mary. She glanced at it, handed it to Huntley, and thereafter turned it unto me, and turned it her back, and gave ane thring with her shoulder, and pass it away, and spake nothing to me. But that thring spoke much of Mary's mood, unrepentant, contemptuous, defiant. The troublous pilgrimage ends. My son, may kinder stars upon thy fortune shine, and may these pleasures gild thy reign that ne'er wad blink on mine. God keep thee frae thy mither's foes, or turn their hearts to thee, and when thou meetest thy mither's friend, remember him for me. Lament of Mary. Ref. Mary Queen of Scots. A Narrative and Defence by Reverend Alexander Walker. 1603. Union of Crowns of Scots and England. James ascends to the English throne. 1603. Walter Ormiston and his wife Janet Turnbull received a charter of the Temple lands of Grahamslaw extending to a markland. Geo noted, Walter aged about 53 years. These lands formerly belonged to the Knights Templar, and on the suppression of their order in Scotland in 1308, were acquired by the Knights of St. John. The charter of the Temple lands was granted by the commissioners of the Second Lord, Geo noted, by order of James VI, Ref. The Ormistons of Teviotdale. 1654. Barony of Ormiston was sold to John Scott of Langshaw, the property being described in the conveyance as All and Hail the Lands and Barony of Ormiston. 1658. John Scott sold the Barony of Ormiston to Kerr of Chatto. 1718. Kerr of Chatto's descendant W.M. Kerr sold the Barony of Ormiston to William Elliot of Wells, who sold it to William Mine, who had acquired a fortune in Georgia. 1840. William Mine's son, Robert Mine, advertised the estate for sale, at the upset price of £38,000. It then passed to the Marquess of Lothian. Note, from the love affairs of Queen Mary. This was written about Mary's personality. Mary in most respects possessed a much finer and nobler nature than Elizabeth. She was a woman of higher courage, of greater conviction, more generous, magnanimous, and confiding, and, apart from her incomparably greater beauty and fascination, possessed mental endowments fully equal if not superior to those of the English Queen. But whilst the caution and love of mastery of the latter always at the critical moment saved her from her weakness, Mary Stuart possessed no such safeguards, and was periodically swept away, helplessly and irremediably, by the irresistible rush of her purely sexual passion. Nearly every writer who has dealt at length with the career of the most beautiful and unhappy of queens has been drawn into the vortex of controversy as to the genuineness or otherwise of the casket letters. And other perhaps more important points of Mary's life have been to some extent neglected or overshadowed by this interesting problem. We shall see that the deplorable errors and follies that led her downward from freedom to lifelong imprisonment, from happiness to misery, from a throne to a scaffold, that warped her goodness, made her a helpless plaything for her cunning enemies, and ruined the religious cause she loved better than her life, were the outcome, not of deliberate wickedness, or even of habitual political unwisdom, but of fits of undisciplined sexual passion, amounting in certain instances to temporary mania, combined with the unquenchable ambition inherited from her mother's house. Beauty and other feminine perfections she must needs have possessed: a lovely hand, a sweet voice, caressing grace and ready tears. Amongst others, many men upon whom she looked were dazzled and blinded by her peculiar personality. Epilogue. The failure of the spiritual authority and the political power of the Catholic Church in Scotland during the reign of Mary was the logical conclusion of the events of the previous reign. It was no small part of Mary's tragedy that she came from the old lax Catholic world, the world of James Vere, and it was not the crown, as James V had feared, but Catholic Scotland he had known that passed with alas. Those who vindicate the conduct of Elizabeth to the woman who should have been her guest, conveniently forget that the plots against the English Queen might have been put an end to by the simple process of sending Mary back to her own country, by carrying out, in fact, what was the duty of one sovereign to another even 3 centuries ago. If Elizabeth and her ministers chose to avert political complications by breaking the law of nations, they had only themselves to thank when their victims seized such weapons as she could find for her own defense. The time may come when the tragedy of Mary Stuart will be seen as it was, will be seen in the light shed upon it by nearly every scrap of untainted evidence we have. Mary was doomed from the hour of her birth. A girl, a beauty and a Catholic, she was born to govern the most turbulent of nations in the dying moments of her own faith, to rule among ambitious and unscrupulous relatives, and with a woman on the English throne who was jealous of her charms, jealous of her maternity, jealous, above all, of her indefeasible claims to the English crown. Other principal parties: Archbishop Bayton, Mary's envoy in Paris, Archbishop of Glasgow, who administered the funds of Mary Stuart's French property, Archbishop of St Andrews Arran, James Hamilton, head of the Hamiltons, claimed to be next heir to the crown following King James V's death, Duke of Châtelherault, Earl of Arran, regent. The Black Laird, James Ormiston, is called cousin of the Earl of Bothwell, by whom he was appointed commander of 1,000 men to guard Queen Mary at Jedburgh. His banner was a field argent with 3 red pelicans feeding their young. Motto: Mea Gloria Fides, i.e., faith is my glory. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, favoured the opposite party, anti-Catholic, Italian. Cardinal Beaton, King James vs. principal advisor. Cardinal Lorraine, Mary Stuart's uncle, Charles of Guise. Chamberlain, the English ambassador in Madrid. Charles Knight, Countess of Lennox, Lady Margaret Douglas, daughter of Queen Margaret Tudor, Mary Stuart's grandmother Henry. Lord Darnley, Dauphine Francis de Croc, French ambassador Diane de Poitiers, Henry's powerful mistress and Mary Stuart's great ally, and Protectress, France, Don Carlos Douglas, family Duke of Alba, Duke of Châtelherault, next heir to the Scottish crown after Emery, Duke of Guise, Mary Stuart's uncle. Earl of Angus, Henry VIII's brother-in-law and brother to Sir George Douglas, Earl of Glencairn, English partisan. Earl of Hertford, Duke of Somerset, Regent of England. Earl of Murray, James Stuart. Edward Tudor, Prince of Wales, Prince Edward IV Fleming. Francis I of France. Francis de Montmorency, son of the Constable, Henry II's old and dearest friend, France, George Douglas. Janet Sinclair, the caretaker nurse of the baby Mary Stuart. James Stuart, second natural child of James V, also known as Regent Moray, illegitimate son of James V by Lady Margaret Erskine. Half-brother to Robert Stuart and Prior of St Andrews Henry VIII, great-uncle to Mary Stuart Huguenots. John, 6th Lord Lindesay of the Byres, was the son of that Lord Lindesay who had distinguished himself as the most faithful and vigilant of Mary's guardians. He was one of the sternest and most uncompromising of her opponents, a zealous Protestant, and firm adherent of Knox. King Edward VI, Henry VI's son, Lennox, Lord Darnley, Henry Stuart, cousin to Mary Stuart and her second husband, son of Matthew Stuart, Earl of Lennox. Lady Margaret Douglas, daughter of Angus and Margaret Tudor by second marriage with Douglas, Earl of Angus. Lady Margaret Erskine became wife of Sir Robert Douglas of Lochleven, Lethington William Maitland, Lindsay and Ruthven, two of the harshest among Mary's opponents. Lord Argyll, original guardians of the baby Queen Mary. Lord Huntley, original guardians of the baby Queen Mary. Lord James Stuart, Mary Stuart's half-brother. Lord Lindesay, who had distinguished himself as the most faithful and vigilant of Mary's guardians, or Lords Keepers, during her babyhood. Marquis d'Elbeuf, brother to Marie de Guise, Mary Livingston. One of the famous four Marys, Marie, Mary of Guise, daughter of branch of the House of Lorraine that settled in France, Queen Dowager of Scotland, Regent Mason, English ambassador in France Matthew Stuart, Earl of Lennox, father of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley Montmorency. Old friend and mentor to Henri II, France, Morton, most powerful nobles in France, the Bourbons, the Chatillons, and the Montmorencis. Murray Oliver St. Clair Prior John Erskine, Queen Mary Stuart together with Lady Fleming Renee of Guise, Abbess of Convent at Rheims, Mary Stuart's aunt Robert Erskine Robert Stuart. Half-brother to James Stuart and Abbot of Holyrood. Raw minorities Ruthven and Lindsay, two of the harshest among Mary's opponents. Sir George Douglas, brother to Earl of Angus, English partisan. Sir John Mason, Peace Commissioner. Sir Nicholas Throckmorton, Sir Robert Douglas of Lochleven, married to Lady Margaret Erskine. Throckmorton, young Earl of Lennox, a gala-sized Scotsman. Sir Ralph Sadleir, English agent. Geo noted Sir James Ormiston was with Mary. 1. During the chase about Raid. 2. At the counting house prior to James' baptism at Jedburgh, Kelso. 3. Battle of Langside. D.F. Hoy Roots and Branches 2010. Entries. 38,665 updated. May 7, 2010. Fry. ID. I-1616 name. Walter Ormiston 1 sex. M birth. ABT 1551 in Roxburgh, Scotland 1 death. ABT 1615 1 event. Family #G28, Mina 71, is also G29, Ninu 6 note. Son and heir of Sir James Ormiston. A minor in July 1564. It may be inferred that he inherited Ancram Mill from his mother. With his second wife Janet Turnbull he received grant to Temple lands of Grahamslaw 1603. In 1628 he was living at Grahamslaw. Father, Sir James Ormiston B., ABT 1515 mother, Ormiston. Marriage 1 Janet Turnbull. Married. ABT 1581. Children. 1. William Ormiston B., ABT 1584 2. Andrew Ormiston B., ABT 1586 in Roxburgh, Scotland 3. George Ormiston B., ABT 16034. Robert Ormiston B., ABT 1614 in Roxburgh, Scotland. Marriage 2 Griselle Rutherford. Married. BF 1602. Sources. 1. Title. John Ormiston UK,